right, thank you everyone for coming. My name is Julie Keynes. I'm professor and chair of the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering. I'm honored to welcome you for our 2022 Distinguished Speaker event and thank our guest, Professor Lucy Suchman, for joining us. In HCDE, we thrive at the critical junction of research, education, and community to cultivate equity, access, and opportunity. With these values in mind, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that we educate future human-centered designers and researchers on this campus on the unceded lands of the Coast Salish people who are still here honoring their ancestral heritage. Discussing Native identities is just the start of our work to lift BIPOC voices in our department. We incorporate a range of equity and inclusion practices, which includes hiring, teaching, admissions, and programming. Our ultimate goal is to foster greater solidarity, care, and collective accountability to all humans. The HCDE Distinguished Speaker Series was created in order to provide a community event where students, staff, faculty, alumni, and friends could gather together to hear talks by renowned academics that have been innovating boldly and thinking deeply about topics that have a profound impact on human-centered design and engineering. The Distinguished Speaker Series would not be possible without the generous support of former HCD Chair Judy Ramey and friend of the department, Stephanie Rosenbaum, for their endowment of this series. We're honored to continue the legacy, and we had a wonderful dinner last night. Finally, I want to thank our HCD staff, especially Zoe Bartholomew, Leah Pistorius, Melissa Ewing, and Stacia Green, and the research committee spearheaded by Associate Professor Charlotte Lee for their efforts in organizing the event today. I'm now going to hand it over to Associate Professor David Rebus, who will be introducing our distinguished speaker, Dr. Lucy Suchman.
Thanks, Julie. Hi, everybody. I'm David Rebus. I'm absolutely honored to be able to introduce Lucy Suchman today. Let me start with a couple of the more official words, give you a little sense of where she comes from, and then I'll get a little more informal. So formally, Lucy Suchman is Professor Emerita of the Anthropology of Science and Technology at Lancaster University in the UK. Before taking up that post, this is really interesting. This gets more interesting as I go along. Before taking up that post, she was principal scientist at Xerox Palo Alto Research Center at Park, where she spent 20 years as a researcher. So here we have a movement from someone who started or worked in industry for many years, and then in the academy. Let me take this off. I want to give you a sense of those two positions. One researching in industry, another one as a professor in the UK. It really demonstrates an enormous range. Let me give you some of the awards that Lucy has won. I'm just going to pick a couple of them to give you a sense of the range of people, groups of people, academic groups of people and non-academic groups of people who found a deep importance in her work. In 2010, the Lifetime Research Award from the Association of Computing Machinery, ACM, from SIGCHI, from Human-Computer Interaction. 2014, the John Desmond Bernal Prize from Society for Social Studies of Science. This is a lifetime award from the group that we call Science and Technology Studies, STS. Very different intellectual kind of community. And then kind of at a different range altogether, 1988, Xerox Corporate Research Group's Excellence in Science and Technology Award. Notice those three kinds of groups, right? Industry, HCI, and then also STS. If you're an HCDE, this is exemplary. For someone like me, who sort of has the foot in the door of many of these kinds of spaces, to see that there's this kind of recognition across these different communities is really, it's inspiring, but also it's really important to note this for us. This isn't the contributions. So I also do kind of historical work. I occasionally look through old manuals in HCI. There's Lucy Suchman. Not as a kind of person who might have said something over there in the corner, but sometimes as adding a kind of central new approach to how do we interact with technologies. Similarly, sometimes I look in old historical AI research from the 80s and 90s. There's Lucy Suchman again. not again as a kind of like gadfly from another field commenting, critiquing AI. Lots of people did that then, lots of people do that now, but as adding a kind of perspective to the field that becomes central to that field. And then just to give another example of an honor, she served as president for the Society for Social Studies of Science from 2016 to 2017. So president of Science and Technology Studies, the field. That is a really difficult range. Very few people touch on that kind of range where acknowledged within as a contribution artificial intelligence, acknowledged as a contribution within HCI, not a kind of commentary, but a contribution. And then also leading in a field that often is very critical, science and technology studies of the fields of technology development, right? That range is really, really impressive. It's impressed me. And I think you know, it speaks to a kind of prescience at every point in time in her career about what's going on next. So by way of introduction, I just want to say to you, I wonder what the next prescient thing that you're going to offer us now is. I'm utterly honored to have you and to have introduced you. I give you Professor Lucy Suchman.
Oh, thank you for that beautiful introduction, David, and thank you for HCDE for this invitation. I'm really honored, and I've spent the day talking to faculty and students, and I have to say I'm blown away by how happy people are in this department. I mean, they're not completely happy, you know, with everything about the university, but they have a love for this department, which they care about and they feel cared for by. And that is a wonderful thing to see. So congratulations on that. So as some of you will know, and as David has just very kindly elaborated, I've worked in multiple areas over the course of my research life, from critical and I hope constructive engagements with human-computer interaction, artificial intelligence and cognitive science, the politics of work and automation, practice-based and participatory design, computer-supported cooperative work, discourses and material practices of design and innovation, including ethnographic reflections on my own years at Xerox PARC, and a deepening involvement with my home field of anthropology, as well as the field of science and technology studies. And today I decided to talk about my most recent work, though as you'll see, there's a kind of through line here that runs back to the early 1980s as well. I wanted to focus on what I'm thinking about in the current moment, but I would also be very glad to engage in discussion on any other questions that you might have across those other areas. So I find myself preoccupied lately by the figures of closed and open worlds. The closed world is the techno-political imaginary, and I'll come back to that in a minute, that underwrote the Cold War arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union at the end of the 20th century, which has been described brilliantly by historian of science Paul Edwards in his 1996 book of that title. Set against this imperial standoff is a decolonial imaginary named by anthropologists Marisol de la Cadena and Mario Blaser in their 2018 book of that title as A World of Many Worlds. This follows calls by indigenous leaders, most famously the Zapatista in Chiapas, Mexico, for, in their words, quote, a world where many worlds fit. For the purposes of my talk, we could take these as two aspirational approaches to global security. One based on containment through military domination, the other on negotiated coexistence across even irreconcilable differences. My current project is to explore the relevance of closed and open world thinking to questions of US militarism and data. And this talk is part of that work in progress. In what follows, I'm going to argue that data-centric approaches to security, particularly those promoted under the sign of AI, require closed worlds for their operation, and that understanding that requirement can help to clarify data's limits. Acknowledging the limits of datafication in turn opens our thinking to other modes of knowledge making that might configure our relations with each other and with the more than human world. So I've referred to the closed world as a technopolitical imaginary, and that's the term that's going to be familiar to some of you and perhaps new to others. Socio-technical imaginaries are defined by science and technology scholars Sheila Jasanoff and Song-Hyun Kim as, quote, collectively held, institutionally stabilized, and publicly performed visions of desirable futures, animated by shared understandings of forms of social life and social order, attainable through and supportive of advances in science and technology. That socio-technical imaginaries are always also political is an idea that's been developed further by Paul Edwards and Gabriel Hecht in their writing about the hybrids of technical systems and political practices through which racialized inequalities in South Africa were maintained under apartheid. A second key term for my talk is obviously datafication. As a simple definition, to datify a phenomenon is to put it in a quantified form that renders it computable. Critical media studies scholars Ulysses Megius and Nick Coldry observe that, quote, the term datafication implies that something is made into data. What that something is and what the processing comprises are matters that need to be put into context. Now, I would add, I've inserted the word explicated here because I think both the somethings and the processes themselves warrant much closer examination as part of putting datafication into context. In her discussion of datafication as a form of discursive violence, Anna Lauren Hoffman, here with you at UW, elaborates on datafication's politics when she writes, quote, datafication represents a discourse that is once social and technological, structuring how various identities and bodies are produced, surfaced, made sense of, seen as legitimate, and ascribed significance. In the remainder of my talk, I'm going to look at what Hoffman characterizes as the discursive violence of datafication through the case of an initiative to reanimate the figure of AI within the technopolitical imaginaries of the US military. But before we dig into the case, we need a brief consideration of the figure of AI itself. I read the term AI as what anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss first named a floating signifier. That is, it's a term that suggests a concrete referent, but it works to escape and even to evade definition in order to maximize its suggestive power. As a kind of working definition, I understand AI to be the cover term for a range of technologies and techniques of data processing and analysis based on the adjustment of relevant parameters according to either internally or externally generated feedback. In the case of machine learning, the currently ascendant form of AI, extremely large curated data sets are analyzed for statistical correlations that, when iteratively adjusted, produce results that are selectively meaningful to humans. These training sets, their associated data models, and the curated results that are produced comprise the closed worlds of ground truth on which AI depends. As these results on a recent search suggest, the rise of AI can be understood itself as something of an imperial project. Now, one way of datifying US militarism is to translate it into levels of spending. So here's a graph showing relative military spending for 2021, which makes clear that the United States is already the overwhelmingly dominant military power. The US defense budget, it's now over $813 billion, already exceeds that of the next 11 most heavily armed countries in the world combined. That includes both China and Russia. The US maintains around 750 military bases around the world in 80 countries. And yet in this context, we find the continuation of a discourse of US vulnerability, most recently framed as a new AI arms race between the US and China. Within this frame, the figure of AI becomes both a threat to security from them and a promise of security for us. That's how the logic of arms races work. as each side increases investment in that which threatens both. With US military dominance in the AI arms races context, let me turn back to the closed world name by Paul Edwards as the, quote, dome of global technological oversight, a technopolitical imaginary that emerged through the US doctrine of containment in 1946, was elaborated in the surveillance technologies and guided weapon systems of the Vietnam War during the 1960s and 70s, and culminated in the US-Soviet arms race of the 1980s with Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense, or as it was affectionately called, Star Wars initiative. Together, these and other developments resulted in an acceleration of efforts towards centralized, remotely controlled military operations based on advanced computing and communications. They disclosed as well, Paul Edwards observes, quote, a wide gap between an official discourse of success and the pessimistic assessments of independent observers, including American soldiers on the ground. And this is a crucial point and one that I'll come back to. So the same year that Reagan launched his Star Wars program, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency announced a 10-year companion initiative called the Strategic Computing Initiative. The centerpiece of SCI was the goal of providing weapon systems with, in the initiative's phrasing, quote, human-like intelligent capabilities. Severo Ornstein, a computer scientist who'd worked on the first strategic air defense system, the semi-automatic ground environment, or SAGE, Brian Cantwell-Smith, then a recent PhD in AI from MIT, and I, then an anthropology PhD student at the University of California at Berkeley, wrote a critique of the SCI for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, arguing that it blurred the distinction between actual progress in computer science and wishful thinking. And without going into detail, I would suggest that the details of that critique could be recycled 40 years later with just a small amount of updating to address contemporary plans for AI-based weapon systems. In the current moment, what Edwards named the dome of global technological oversight has been reanimated, again through the promise of AI. What we're seeing here is an artist's rendering of the Israeli Defense Forces projected sensor-to-shooter network named Fireweaver, designed to provide troops with, quote, real-time, accurate battle information displayed directly on their weapon sites, including artificial intelligence algorithms to process data and prioritize fires allocation. And this graphic is indicative of an imaginary that is shared across the US Defense Department and its allies. The premise of that imaginary remains firmly rooted in mid-20th century information processing psychology. This conceptualization of military cognition has been institutionalized as the canonical observe, orient, decide, and act, or OODA loop, first set out in the mid-1990s by US Air Force Colonel John Boyd in a series of DoD briefing papers. Most relevant for my analysis is not so much the figure as the white space in which it appears. To put it another way, this figure sits on empty ground, and that's a problem that I'll come back to shortly. The model is elaborated in a recent rereading of Boyd by his associate Chet Richards. Richards emphasizes that despite the common depiction, Boyd never actually figured his conception of the loop as a sequential or circular course of action. In a much more cybernetic model, Boyd himself diagrams the OODA loop as shown here, and he offers this reading focused on the critical phases of observation and orientation. He writes, quote, the entire orientation bubble, including the blocks and all of the interactions between them, represents our mental models of reality that are making predictions about the effects of our actions. The observation bubble includes all the ways we bring in information from the external world, as well as about our own bodies and minds. End of the quote. Datafication on this model will require the translation of those floating arrowed labels labeled unfolding circumstances and outside information and the like into computationally legible signals that in the sensor to shooter imaginary will control the conduct of war. The bounded units of the diagram's bubbles and the empty white spaces of its ground index containment's aspiration to close the world. Since the 1990s, the OODA sequence has continued to serve as a normative model of what in common military parlance is called situational awareness, promoted most industriously by Mika Ensley, former chief scientist of the United States Air Force. Situational awareness is defined by Ensley as, quote, the perception of environmental elements and events with respect to time or space, the comprehension of their meaning, and the projection of their future states. Writing in the late 1990s, Ensley and her colleagues scale up situational awareness to global information awareness when they write, quote, it is expected that US forces will need to operate at considerable distances from home and existing bases as dictated by the actions of unpredictable hostile forces in various areas of the world. This necessitates global awareness, information of suitable resolution and short update rates from any location on the globe, end quote. A connecting thread across these models is a kind of objectivist epistemology that's well suited to the elision of signals, data, and information. The white space that is their ground is taken for granted as the world out there that presents itself to military agents who act, a kind of objectively existing surrounding environment that can be perceived directly and to which the warfighter needs to respond. There's a presumption that relevant events will be detectable to various sensors, human and technological, that measure changes in the environment. The problems that arise are framed in terms of insufficiencies in the number of signals, the amount of data available along with the speed of its transmission and processing, rather than anything more fundamental about how military knowledge systems make their worlds. Because as we know, the greater the distance from life on the ground, the greater is the reliance on highly questionable systems of identification and categorization. Gregoire Chemayot sets this out beautifully in his book, A Theory of the Drone, where he describes how aerial surveillance is combined with the interception of signals from satellites and smartphones, translated through social network analysis into the development of profiles, what he calls guilt by association, as well as stereotypic patterns of life. While machine sensing and data storage at scale are imagined as the infrastructure for global awareness, building out those infrastructures has, not surprisingly, proven much more straightforward than the translation from signals to data and from data to timely and meaningful information. And it's in this context that AI has been revived as a promised techno solution, promoted by an alliance of military technophiles and commercial, more specifically, Silicon Valley advisors. In April of 2016, then Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter created the Defense Innovation Board, charged with catalyzing innovation across the Department of Defense and helping to bring Silicon Valley best practices to the DoD. And they're pictured here at an open meeting in 2018 at the headquarters of the Companion Defense Innovation Unit, which was a venture capital operation created to fund military-oriented startups. The board's initial chair was Eric Schmidt, former CEO and executive chairman of Google and then of Google's parent company, Alphabet. The board was managed by executive director Joshua Marcusa, former advisor to the Pentagon in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. So Marcusa served as manager of the DIB from August 2016 to March 2020, when the board was disbanded, and then 2 months later took a job as head of strategy and innovation for the global public sector at Google. DIB members included executives of Google, Facebook, and Microsoft, as well as senior management at select technical universities who've long benefited by funding from the DoD. The board's work was set up as a parallel process, including public listening sessions, panels with AI experts, and regular DIB consultation with an internal Pentagon working group. In April of 2019, I received an invitation to participate in a DIB AI ethics roundtable at Stanford University. While I attended the event and the public listening session that preceded it, I found it impossible to contribute either to contribute or to intervene effectively, given the event's framing, which placed all of my concerns, ranging from just what we mean when we talk about AI to the unlawfulness of current US targeted assassination practices, place those outside the bounds of our mandate to deliver a set of AI ethics principles to the DoD. Those principles were delivered nonetheless, and they've been widely celebrated by those who composed them and those who received them. 1 year after the DIB's inception in April of 2017, the DoD announced plans for its flagship AI project, the Algorithmic Warfare Cross-Functional Team, codenamed Project Maven and accompanied by this quite extraordinary logo. The announcement of Project Maven by then Deputy Secretary of Defense Robert Work asserted the urgent need to incorporate artificial intelligence and machine learning across DoD operations. Project Maven's aim more specifically, Work states in his memorandum, is, quote, to turn the enormous volume of data available to the DoD in the form of full motion video into actionable intelligence and insights at speed, end quote. The plan, as Work sets it out, includes an initial project focused on the task of labeling data within full motion video, images generated by US drone surveillance operations, as a first step toward establishing the algorithms and computational infrastructures needed to automate object detection, classification, and alerts in support of military operations. Maven came under public scrutiny thanks to a small but significant rebellion on the part of Google employees against the company's participation in the project. Those of us who joined in support of the insurgent Googlers pointed out that further automation of targeting in the US drone program can only serve to worsen an operation that is already highly problematic, even arguably illegal and immoral under the laws and norms of armed conflict. The resistance in the tech community was summarized plainly by Eric Schmidt himself in a keynote address at the Center for New American Security's Artificial Intelligence and Global Security Summit in November of 2017. Schmidt cited resistance to Project Maven as, quote, a general concern of somehow the military industrial complex using their stuff to kill people incorrectly, end quote. Schmidt himself explains the problem of machine learning when applied to what he characterizes as the abnormal, he says. But the other thing that's worth saying is that these algorithms, at least today, require a great deal of training data. And when I say a great deal, I mean like millions of entries in the matrices, billions of pieces of data. So the classic example, people would say, well, can't you figure out terrorism? Well, the good news, terrorism is very rare, right? So it's much, much harder, if you will, to apply AI to that problem. Whereas trying to understand traffic, right, as an example of something that occurs every day is far, far easier because you have so much training data. I really applaud Eric for this statement. These reservations notwithstanding, in the same discussions, Schmidt cited Project Maven very approvingly as a project that, in his words, combines a lot of these very clever systems. And while the exact nature of the targets of analysis under development in the project remains unclear, at least the imaginary of an apparatus for the recognition of a terrorist threat continues to circulate. As an indicative example, Fortune magazine, in an article titled 3 Ways AI is Making You Safer, reports that, quote, Project Maven, the Pentagon's most high-profile AI initiative, aims to use machine learning algorithms to identify terrorist targets from drone footage, end quote. The Maven contract subsequently moved to Anduril Industries, whose CEO Palmer Luckey stated in media interviews that he hoped that the firm's current virtual reality system, Lattice, will develop into, quote, an AI-powered sensor fusion platform that helps US soldiers achieve perfect omniscience while in combat. The media reports surrounding Project Maven overwhelmingly beg the question of just what its objects are, because that's classified, and the criteria by which objects are identified as being imminent threats. We are told that there were some 38 categories used by those who hand labeled the first 150,000 images to form the initial training data, including the object, an ISIS pickup truck. This raises the question of the presumed kind of self-evidence of objects and the relation between systems for the categorization of decontextualized images of objects, so in this case, a truck, and the question of how objects are incorporated into complex and changing relations and associated practices. The claims for precision that justify new investments in automated targeting systems are based on a systematic conflation of the relation between a weapon and its designated target on one hand, and the identification of what constitutes a legitimate target on the other. So no amount of improvement in the technologies of the first can address the growing uncertainties of the second. Insisting that they can is part of a campaign to deny the increasing reliance of the US military's so-called war on terror on ever more questionable forms of stereotypic categorization of what and who constitutes a legitimate target, and the expanding temporal and spatial boundaries of what comprises an imminent threat. We can get a graphic sense of this problem in this rendering of so-called precision airstrikes carried out by the US and coalition military in Pakistan from 2004 through 2015. These are data compiled by the Bureau of Investigative Journalism and visualized by Pitch Interactive. So the visualization graphs 3,341 fatalities from every known drone attack during that period. The frequency of strikes is rendered above the line, the midline, and the count of persons killed below. So we can start by noting this enormous surge in strikes, beginning with Obama's presidency in 2009. And reading the coded band across the top of the image, moving from left to right, we travel from this very small patch of bright red, that's the 190 or 5.7% of the victims positively identified as children, to the somewhat larger band of crimson, which is the 534 or 16% of those killed identified as civilians. And then to the right of these, almost 25% of the deaths attributed the status of collateral damage is the most almost indiscernible white portion of the band, which indicates the 52 people or 1.6% of those killed who were positively identified as so-called high profile or high value targets. And then finally, we're left with the remainder, the literal, oops, sorry about that. Yes, you've got it. So we're left with the remainder, which is the literal, sorry, I've lost this literal gray zone of 2,565 people, or 76.7% of those killed, who are categorized simply as other. That is, the Defense Department never actually identified who those people were. So this calls into question statements like this by Obama's assistant to the president for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism, John Brennan, in 2012, quote, "With the unprecedented ability of remotely piloted aircraft to precisely target a military objective while minimizing collateral damage, one could argue that never before has there been a weapon that allows us to distinguish more effectively between an al-Qaeda terrorist and innocent civilians." As part of the 2019 National Defense Authorization Act, Congress created the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, NSCAI. The chairman of the commission is, guess who, Eric Schmidt, and the vice chairman is, guess again, former Deputy Secretary of Defense Robert Work, you may remember was the author of the 2017 memo establishing Project Maven. Much like the DIB, members of the commission comprise current and former CEOs and other senior managers of big tech companies, current former members of the defense and intelligence agencies, and senior members of universities with extensive DoD funding. Nominated to serve on the grounds that they have the relevant expertise, all arguably also have vested interests in increased funding for AI research and development. Nonetheless, Chair Eric Schmidt states in a public plenary that in the commissioners, quote, "We ended up with a representative team of America." The commission's final report, which was released in March of 2021, calls on the federal government to double research and development spending for AI annually to reach $32 billion by 2026. In a public plenary in February 2021, the commission's co-chair, Robert Work, offers this demonstration of moral reasoning. He says, The biggest contributor to inadvertent engagements is target misidentification. Humans make mistakes all the time in battle. And the hypothesis is to be proven that artificial intelligence will improve target identification, which should improve and reduce the number of collateral damages, reduce the number of fratricides. So it is a moral imperative to at least pursue this hypothesis. Now, this hypothesis enacts a familiar move. Failures of existing human-based socio-technical systems become the justification for the further automation of those same systems. Combining magical thinking with a leap of faith, which is here named a hypothesis, the proposition is that the automated systems will somehow transcend the limits of the very knowledge practices that must necessarily inform them. But we now have ample evidence that the automation of data analytics works to reproduce and amplify the classificatory schemas that inform the data set. And nowhere is this more treacherous than when the data set is made up of proxy signals and profiles and so-called patterns of life. The most recent investment in a dome of global technological oversight is the initiative named Joint All-Domain Command and Control, or JADC2. Pictured here as the JADC2 placemat, I'm sure you all want one of those. Figure 1 from the DoD summary of the JADC2 strategy, which was released in March of this year. This figure is characterized by analysts from the Hudson Institute, which is a conservative think tank, as, quote, a graphic that was confusing even by Defense Department standards. In a press conference announcing the initiative, Secretary of the Air Force for Public Affairs Charles Pope promised that, quote, as envisioned, JADC2 will allow US forces from all services to sense, make sense, and act upon a vast array of data and information, fusing and analyzing the data with the help of machine learning and artificial intelligence, and providing warfighters with preferred options at speeds not seen before. So if these closed worlds deny their kind of leaky boundaries, disclosing those openings provides an opportunity for critical intervention. Carlo Caduce's prescient account of the early warning system developed to monitor emergent pandemics could just as well apply to the military imaginary of all-domain command and control, he writes. The vision of a global surveillance network and early warning system described by experts in reports is often more virtual than real. The network is dispersed, the ties are thin, the surveillance erratic, and the meaning of the information uncertain. The network is fragmented and fraught with inconsistencies. It is pictured as a seamless system of surveillance, but this is primarily the network's own mythology of coherence, logic, and rationality. The work of challenging that mythology is being done by a growing coalition of researchers and investigative journalists. To take just one indicative example, critical international relations scholars Nicola Perugini and Neve Gordon consider the generative effects of military investment in a machinery of situational awareness based on the subjection of big data to algorithmic analysis. Perugini and Gordon write, quote, following Foucault's notion of dispositif, we understand these new technologies and epistemic operations as part of an apparatus of distinction, which denotes an array of interrelated forces that frame, shape, produce, and construe, and thus give meaning to the relationship among the actors within the battle space. To get a sense of this dispositif, we need look no further than the act of targeted assassination posited to mark the end of US operations in Afghanistan this past August, an operation that I would argue is emblematic of the US apparatus of distinction. A New York Times investigation of the strike opens with this paragraph. It was the last known missile fired by the United States in its 20-year war in Afghanistan, and the military called it a righteous strike, a drone attack after hours of surveillance on August 29 against a vehicle that American officials thought contained an ISIS bomb and posed an imminent threat to troops at Kabul's airport. Military officials said they did not know the identity of the car's driver when the drone fired, but deemed him suspicious because of how they interpreted his activities that day, saying that he possibly visited an ISIS safe house and at one point loaded what they thought could be explosives into the car. Zemari Ahmadi, it turns out, was a longtime aid worker with an American NGO. Subsequent forensic evidence suggests that his travels that day involved transporting colleagues to and from work, and an analysis of video feeds showed that what the military saw and translated through its professional vision into explosives was Mr. Ahmadi and a colleague loading canisters of water into his car to bring home to his family. Times reporting showed that the strike killed 10, including 7 children, in a dense residential block occupied by Ahmadi, his 2 brothers, and their families. In remarks immediately following the strike, Chairman of the US Joint Chiefs General Mark Milley conceded that the US was aware of at least 3 deaths besides their target. Quote, "Were there others killed? Yes. Yes, there are others killed. Who they are, we don't know," end quote. In a subsequent statement issued on the 17th of September, General Kenneth McKenzie, who directed the strike, characterized it as, quote, "a horrible tragedy of war." Far from an anomaly, this strike is indicative of US operations, the only difference here being its public visibility in the Western media. Close analyses of many other incidents by investigative journalists in the DoD itself make clear that the problem of situational awareness in military operations is not a matter of inadequate sensor networks or access to information, but of the frames of war into which militarism subjects and objects are incorporated. Claims for the precision of US operations have now been definitively challenged in an extraordinary series of articles in the New York Times by investigative journalist Asmat Khan. She writes, "Over the past 3 years, I obtained more than 1,300 credibility assessments from the US Defense Department through the Freedom of Information Act. The reports cover allegations surrounding airstrikes that took place between September 2014 and January 2018. What I saw after studying them was not a series of tragic errors, but a pattern of impunity, of a failure to detect civilians, to investigate on the ground, to identify causes and lessons learned, to discipline anyone or find wrongdoing that would prevent these recurring problems from happening again. It was a system that seemed to function almost by design to not only mask the true toll of American airstrikes, but also legitimize their expanded use." The documents revealed how unreliable the information that justified the strikes often was. So white bags of ammonium nitrate at a homemade explosives factory were most likely bags of cotton at a cotton gin. A supposed ISIS headquarters was the longtime home of 2 brothers and their wives and children. A, quote, adult male associated with ISIS was actually an elderly female. A man with a weapon, quote, on his left shoulder had no weapon. Males on 5 motorcycles driving quickly and in formation, displaying the signature of an imminent attack, were just guys on motorbikes. A heavy object being dragged into a building was in fact a child. Along with the records, Khan's reporting is based on 5 years of on-the-ground investigations, and she concludes, "On the ground, I found a pattern of life that was very different from the one that the military described in its credibility assessments, and documented death rates that vastly exceeded US Central Command's own numbers. I also came away with a grim understanding of how America's new high-tech air war looks to civilians who live beneath it, people in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan trying to raise families, earn a living, and stay away from the fighting as best they can." Analyses like Khan's of the use of remotely controlled weapon systems should make clear the further problems inherent in untethering these systems from their human controllers, which military technophiles take as the next logical step in the automation of warfare. This is a process that I've been involved in working to interrupt, along with colleagues in a campaign led by Human Rights Watch, focused to date on the UN Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, or CCW, which is a body charged with establishing prohibitions or restrictions on the use of certain conventional weapons, which may be deemed to be excessively injurious or to have indiscriminate effects. Following a report by the UN Special Rapporteur to the Human Rights Council, Christoph Haynes, in 2013, member states agreed to begin discussions on what were named lethal autonomous weapon systems, systems in which the critical functions of target identification and the initiation of attack has been put under fully automated machine control. As a member of the International Committee for Robot Arms Control, part of this NGO coalition, I presented testimony at the CCW in April of 2016 in a panel on the question of machine autonomy. In my brief contribution, I argued that the discriminations presupposed by the principle of distinction in international humanitarian law, that is, identifying someone as a combatant, or more widely as an imminent threat, cannot be specified algorithmically. Because rules of engagement and the laws of war, like any normative prescript, presuppose capacities of situational awareness that they do not and cannot fully specify, it's impossible to design an autonomous weapon system that could adhere to the laws of war. And I'd be glad to say more about that in our discussion. Judith Butler directs our attention to the limits of intelligibility as a kind of methodological strategy that provides an opening for change. In a 2002 essay, she writes, "So not only is it necessary to isolate and identify the peculiar nexus of power and knowledge that gives rise to the field of intelligible things, but also to track the way in which that field meets its breaking point, the moments of its discontinuities, the sites where it fails to constitute the legibility for which it stands. What this means is that one looks both for the conditions by which the object field is constituted, but also for the limits of those conditions, the moments where they point up their contingency and their transformability. Rather than further incorporation into the closed world imaginary of datafication, this would suggest that military operations need rereading through a performative understanding of accountable perception and action. Read in that way, the radical openness of a world of many worlds poses an enduring problem for the project of AI and its promises of accuracy and containment. In the introduction to their book, De la Cadena and Blasser consider the growing tension between technopolitical imaginaries rooted in the imperial expeditions of 15th century Europe and what they name, quote, the obstinate demands for existence of forms of life assumed to be expendable by colonial projects. What John Law has called the one world is exemplified in the military imaginaries that I've described here. In contrast, De la Cadena and Blasser embrace a political ontology that, quote, simultaneously stands for reworking an imaginary of politics, what they call the pluriverse, for a field of study and intervention, the power-charged terrain of entangled worldings and their dynamics, and for a modality of analysis and critique that is permanently concerned with its own effects as a worlding practice. Recognizing the limits of its knowledge practices is anathema to the military project, but those limits exist nonetheless. While we need to pay attention in the current moment to the enormous expansion of signal generating infrastructures, we also, I'm arguing, need to attend to that which escapes capture by datafication, for better and worse, from complex social relations to the lived experiences of those who find themselves at the center of targeted discrimination and the exercise of violent power. Thinking with the trope of the closed world about the ways in which datification infuses the US military, we can see how continued commitments to containment leave the constitutive outsides, the white space of data's ground truths outside the frame. In the military case, this cold world thinking underwrites the fantasy that sensor to shooter infrastructures enabled through machine learning will render the battle space transparent to us, but also secure from them. I've traced the logical limits and, more importantly, empirically demonstrable and arguably criminal failures of that project, despite its obscene appropriations of public funds. And I've argued that imaginaries of omniscience are founded on a kind of willful ignorance, which calls on us to refigure situational awareness from a dome of global technological oversight to public awareness of datafication's limits, as we cultivate decolonial alternatives to containment as the basis for a just security and for sustainable planetary futures. Thanks.
Lucy Suchman for a really thought-provoking and sobering talk. Thank you for this provocation and call to action. I'm Professor Charlotte Lee. I am the chair of the research committee here at HCDE. We do a lot of internal, external connections research, including organizing this wonderful Distinguished Lecture series, and it's just been an honor to have Lucy here today. We have a Q&A session now, and so Lucy has offered to take questions, field questions from the audience, and I will also field some questions from our URL. We did have some issues with the slides advancing and the online data stream, so we will make that recording available to folks who are watching online. Slides.
QED.
So take it away and I'll look for questions online.
Great. Yes, but
let's see. I'm Whitfield Diffie. I'm an outsider to this this group, but not so much the military discussion.
not so much to the field, I would say, yeah.
I'm curious, this AI-driven, smart weapons and so forth is the successor to the great military development of the 20th century, which is aerial bombing.
Yes.
Which takes its high form in carpet bombing, fire bombing, and nuclear weapons.
Yes.
And the question is, that thing you showed about how they killed 1.5% real targets and 76% people who happen to be standing around is dreadful. The question is, has it improved or unimproved over 20th century technique?
Yeah, this is one of those, would you rather be hung or shot questions. So I want to reframe it a little bit. I mean, first of all, absolutely, this is about air power, right? And so much of this is about the history of air power. I don't want to get caught in the, is drone targeting better than carpet bombing? I don't want either of those, right? So I hear what you're saying. And there's no question that the kind of indiscriminate bombing, I mean, we need to look no further than what's going on right now in Ukraine to see, dreadful, old-fashioned, horrific, so, I don't like any of these things. But I also don't want to kind of fall into the, well, it could be worse. I want to keep pushing on what are the claims that are being made here, in which enormous amounts of money are being invested, and what are the lost opportunity costs, right? I mean, that's what I'm really concerned about, is that what does this 813 billion and rising budget for the military mean for, we can't even begin to imagine what kind of innovations there might be in international relations, in diplomacy, in creative, innovative diplomacy, because those things are completely neglected. The State Department was pretty much dismantled under Trump, and so we, I want to see things shift away from militarism overall. And yeah.
I have a question about the ethics, and just recently in the New York Times, there was an article about a member of the Air Force who committed suicide.
Yes, I saw that.
And he was involved in performing the drone strikes. And there was initially a thought that, well, because it's a distance from performing these horrendous actions, that aids people involved in them, but this actually added to the stress that people in the Air Force were undergoing. And I'm curious about the addition of the AI layer, and if you could speak more to people involved on the military side, what kind of ethical ramifications does that have?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And yeah, I mean, the injuries, are on all sides here. And, I confess that I have way less access to people in the military than I would like to have. because I am very interested in what experienced military people might have to say about some of these proposals for the automation of surveillance and targeting. But there's also a really powerful kind of what I referred to as professional vision that gets sort of imposed on what's being seen on the ground. You know, there's a tremendous orientation. So much of what that kind of surveillance-based air power is about defending US troops on the ground. And so if there are US troops on the ground in the area, the chances, everything's going to be seen differently, right? So it's that vision is you know, very dynamic and very framed by those orientations. And so, you know, which makes, I mean, I can't even begin to imagine what it would be like, what it would mean to automate this kind of object identification. You know, I mean, you cannot take success in the differentiation of cats and dogs, you know, two incredibly stable categories. Now, you know, people would argue there's huge amounts of heterogeneity within those categories, but you know, these are domestic animals. We're familiar with them. They're very stable categories, and you know, it is the success in those kinds of systems. There's no way you can translate that, you know, and even that truck, right? That ISIS pickup truck, right? So you know, what constitutes something as an ISIS pickup truck? It's not intrinsic to the object. It's relational, right? And it's very complex relations, really complex relations on the ground there, where, you know, your brother-in-law knows somebody who knows somebody who, and it's all tracked on your cell phone. And that person comes to lunch and, you know, our house gets targeted, right? So this is like the farthest from an appropriate application as far as I'm concerned, right? And that's not being acknowledged, basically.
I would say there's been a question, some folks online are asking to repeat the question. They're having trouble.
Okay, absolutely. Yeah, sorry.
There's one question from Aisha in Syracuse asking, what do you think will be the biggest impact of AI on society?
Okay, did everyone hear that question? What do I think will be the biggest impact of AI on society? I think it's already happened, and it's a huge distraction. I mean, that's the best case. It's a huge lost opportunity cost and diversion. And in the worst case, it is, you know, the baking in to big data and algorithmic systems of historically generated patterns of discriminatory profiling and social sorting. Yeah, what can I say? I mean, you know, it's not that I think there are no uses for AI, but I just think it's so out of proportion to the investments that are being made. Okay, Stephanie. Yeah.
Okay, so back in the 1990s, back in the 1990s, Digital Equipment Corporation started to develop and release their first expert systems. And the challenge was the time investment it took to actually get expertise from experts and translate it into systems. And so when Lucy, when you talk about datafication, it's the same thing. It's the 15,000, the data set of only 150,000 that was being used for training data.
Yes.
So I guess the question is, I mean, I'm from industry, so I'm nibbling away at it. The question is, what can real people do to try to create relevant and useful and categorized training data sets?
Okay, yeah. So the question is about the, the labor required to, back in the old days, to develop expert systems, and in the current moment for machine learning systems, and what we can do to try to, well, first of all, absolutely acknowledge which that labor gets completely sort of hand waved and erased in this discourse about machine learning. And that's, it's outsourced to, Amazon Mechanical Turk and other kinds of gig workers. So we have to really recognize that labor and where that labor is and how it works. And then I think, for me, your question raises the issue of appropriate applications for machine learning. And, I'm really interested in that. If anybody has, the thing that gets pointed to frequently is protein folding, and like that's a big success area. Okay, I guess for me, I both wonder what is left out of the frame there in terms of what it would take to get those results actually deployed in the form of what new pharmaceuticals or however else they might actually be put into the world in a useful way. And I also wonder again, what the opportunity costs are. What is the problem for which that's a solution, and what other kinds of solutions might, so if it's a public health problem, is AI really the best investment in public health? What about other areas that are totally neglected, and like frontline healthcare workers? So I'm always interested in what's getting marginalized in order for these things to be sort of put in the center. And yeah.
For me, one question is that these systems assume that there is a clear boundary between X and not X.
Yes.
But it's not fixed.
Yes.
In many cases, I think that would be one distinguishing thing. What fields support that kind of crisp boundary?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a great question. So Gigi's question is about the presupposition that your categories have clearly defined boundaries, and that something is this or not this, right? And this is, in science and technology studies, there's a lot of interest in boundaries and how boundaries get made. And this is a pragmatic issue, right? Even in the case of cats and dogs, we sort of, within every category, there's enormous amounts of heterogeneity. And we make what Karen Barad, who's a science studies scholar, would say, agential cuts. We say, okay, we're going to, for these practical purposes, these two categories are sufficiently stable and useful in some way. So we're going to, so I think, those are the criteria. What are the grounds for stabilizing and fixing these categories for particular purposes? And even though we recognize that, there's some artifice involved, is it worth it, right? Does it have a good outcome? And so that's one part of the answer. And then the other part is that we can see things in the world where it's just so clearly impossible to make that kind of delineation, or to do it without enormous injury to all the things that don't fit right within the categories. So I think both of those things are important. Yeah. Ooh.
You mentioned AI as a cover. And I don't remember the date, but in the last few years, the IEEE has come out saying, okay, let's stop with the AI. Let's talk about autonomous systems and intelligent systems. And, and then our colleague here was mentioning expert systems. So I'm just curious what your thinking is on like these terminology shifts and what the work of AI as a cover and that kind of language.
Yeah. So the question is about sort of the term AI, and and I take from your question the kind of movements to embrace it to distance from it, depending on how sort of the wind is blowing. I mean, I'm astounded by the kind of currency that AI has at the moment in the US Defense Department. I think thanks overwhelmingly to this collaboration between Eric Schmidt and Robert Work and the various commissions and so forth. So, it is a thing right there. Nobody's apologizing, nobody qualifies it. I think efforts to specify more, to say more specifically what we're talking about, frankly, I think automation is what we're talking about, right? And then automation is an incredibly complex and varied, and but these are this is all about automation, and autonomy has to do with sort of where the cuts are made, in terms of how the thing that's taken to be an autonomous entity is delineated. Intelligence, I don't know, I'm just not a big fan of it. So I love it in people when it's actually demonstrated, but okay, yeah.
How much of our analysis of the limitations of this algorithmic approach is interconnected with the horrors of the domain of the military domain? If this was humanitarian aid, if the actor was the International Red Cross, if we were identifying people suffering from famine, and instead of targeting them to kill them, we were targeting them to deliver food and water and medicine. What would that do to our tolerance
Yep.
to the limitations and where we go from here?
Yeah. So the question is really about kind of these areas of military applications of AI and sort of AI for good, right? I mean, and for me, the question is still going to be why AI, right? I mean, if we look at humanitarian assistance, a lot of people on the ground, they know who's hungry, right? A lot of these things are about giving a lot more voice to people on the ground, giving a lot more funding and support for people on the front lines, on the ground doing work, who already know what's going on. So again, I think we have to really think about what are the areas of ignorance for which these technologies are really enlightening in ways that we can't get at in other ways. But this comes back to, where is there money to be made, right? And there is a lot of money to be made from these technologies, and there's not a lot of money to be made by the same actors from the kinds of applications that you're talking about. So now, we're into the whole political economy of this, which is probably a good place to leave it, right? Good place to go to start drinking, I think.
Well, that actually is my closing. So let's thank Dr. Suchman one more time. Thank you so much for a really wonderful talk. I hope you'll stick around for reception and food and coffee if you'd like to ask Lucy more questions. We apologize for the hiccup online. I think your point was well taken. Also, thank you so much to Judy and Stephanie for their support of this, and to Charlotte and the research committee for all their organization, and everyone for the staff. So thank you all. Enjoy the reception and have a great day.